A female cop vanished in '77. 13 years later, her car emerged from the ocean's depths. Inside, not just rust, but a conspiracy designed to keep her truth buried. The sea, however, had other plans. The relentless Pacific wind, a constant sculptor of the Bensfield coastline, carried with it the briny tang of salt and the faintest whisper of secrets long held by the unforgiving cliffs. It was a morning like any other in the late autumn of 1990, the sky a muted canvas of grey, when the rusted skeleton of a forgotten tragedy was wrenched from the ocean's grasp. Captain Ray Collins, his face a roadmap of years spent navigating these treacherous waters, squinted against the glare reflecting off the churning surf. His fishing trawler, the Sea Serpent, bobbed with uneasy rhythm, its engine a low thrum against the roar of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below Blackwood Point. It was a treacherous stretch of coastline, one that even seasoned mariners approached with a healthy dose of respect and a silent prayer. He'd seen his share of debris washed ashore over the decades, lost cargo, remnants of storms, the sad detritus of lives interrupted by the indifferent power of the sea. But this was different. Wedged precariously between two colossal, seaweed-slicked boulders, its form mangled and encrusted with 13 years of marine growth, was the unmistakable outline of a vehicle, or what was left of it. The initial sighting had been a mere anomaly, a dark shape against the grey stone that his experienced eye had snagged upon. Curiosity, that persistent human itch, had drawn him closer, battling the surge and swell. As the Sea Serpent maneuvered with practiced ease, the true nature of the discovery began to assert itself through the layers of rust and oceanic reclamation. It was a car, or rather, the ghost of one. Most of its metallic skin had been devoured by the corrosive embrace of salt water and time, leaving behind a skeletal frame that looked more like a monstrous sea creature than anything man-made. Yet, certain features stubbornly clung to existence. A piece of twisted chrome here, a shard of what might have once been a taillight there. And then, the detail that sent a jolt, cold and sharp, through Captain Collins' weathered frame, a section of the chassis, miraculously somewhat preserved in a pocket of rock, bore the faint, almost spectral, remnants of what looked like official lettering. He cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the mournful cry of a distant gull and the relentless sigh of the waves. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken premonitions. With a grunt, Collins leaned over the railing, his gaze fixed on the wreckage. He'd been a younger man, not yet a captain, when the whispers had first started, the uneasy murmurs that had rippled through the small, close-knit community of Bensfield. A young cop vanished. A car swallowed by the night. He remembered the posters, the worried faces, the fruitless searches that had eventually faded into resigned acceptance, another unsolved mystery filed away in the town's collective memory. His first mate, a young lad named Billy, barely out of his teens and new to the Sea Serpent, peered over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of morbid fascination and youthful apprehension. "What is it, Cap? Looks like it's been down there a lifetime." Collins didn't answer immediately. He was tracing the corroded lines, his mind dredging up a name, a face. Linda McAllister, the town's first female officer. Bright, they'd said. Fearless. Gone too soon. He remembered the unease that had settled over Bensfield, the unspoken fear that if one of their own, an officer of the law, could simply disappear, then no one was truly safe. "Get the binoculars, Billy," Collins said, his voice gruff, betraying none of the sudden turmoil within him. He needed a closer look, needed to confirm the sickening suspicion that was now taking root in his gut. Billy scrambled to obey, returning moments later with the powerful lenses. Collins took them, his hands surprisingly steady as he raised them to his eyes, focusing on the section of relatively intact metal. The magnification cut through the distance and the decay. He could make out a few letters, ghostly white against the oxidized metal, and beneath them, something that could have been a shield, an emblem. And then, lower down, near where a wheel hub should have been, a glint of something less corroded, something that had been partially protected by a thick layer of hardened silt. He adjusted the focus, his breath catching in his throat. Numbers. Faded, pitted, but undeniably there. A license plate. He lowered the binoculars slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. 13 years. 13 years she'd been down there, her final moments trapped within that metal coffin, while life up above had moved on, her memory fading like an old photograph. The official story had been vague, unsatisfactory. An accident, perhaps. She'd lost control on the winding coastal road during a storm, plunged into the unforgiving ocean. No witnesses, no wreckage found. Case closed, eventually, but the whispers had always persisted. Darker theories of foul play, of enemies made in the line of duty. "Billy," Collins said, his voice heavy, "radio the Coast Guard, and then call Sheriff Thompson's office. Tell them we found something. Something they've been looking for a very long time." He paused, his gaze drawn back to the mangled wreck, a tomb reclaimed by the sea. "Tell them we think we found Officer McAllister's patrol car." The wind seemed to howl a mournful dirge around them, and the grey sky wept a light, chilling drizzle. Below, the relentless waves continued their assault on the cliffs, as if trying to reclaim the secret they had been forced to surrender. The discovery didn't just dredge up a forgotten vehicle. It resurrected a host of unanswered questions, a dormant investigation, and the ghost of a young woman whose disappearance had left an indelible scar on the town of Bensfield. Why had it taken so long? And what really happened on that fateful spring night in 1977, when Officer Linda McAllister drove into the darkness and never returned? The ocean had given up one of its secrets, but in doing so, it promised to unleash a storm of another kind entirely. The news of the discovery at Blackwood Point ripped through Bensfield like the winter gales that often lashed the small coastal town. It spread from the docks to the diner, from the police station to the quiet, tree-lined streets where Linda McAllister had once walked, her smile as radiant as the California sun she so loved. For 13 years, her name had been a hushed echo, a reminder of a wound that had scarred the community, never quite healing, only papered over with the passage of time and the pressing concerns of daily life. Now, the past, dredged from the unforgiving depths, was raw and immediate once more. Linda. Even the name conjured images of vitality. She had been Bensfield's own. At 26, she wasn't just Officer Linda McAllister, badge number 107. She was a beacon. In 1975, when she'd pinned on that shield, she had shattered a very visible ceiling in a town steeped in tradition. Bensfield Police Department, like most across the country in that era, was a bastion of masculinity. The notion of a woman on patrol, facing the same dangers, wielding the same authority, had been met with a spectrum of reactions, from outright skepticism and thinly veiled derision in some quarters, to a grudging respect that grew with every competent, courageous act she performed. She hadn't been a token. Linda possessed a fierce determination that belied her warm demeanor. Her father, a retired Marine, had instilled in her a profound sense of duty and an unshakable moral compass. She'd graduated top of her class at the academy, her physical prowess and sharp intellect quieting many of the initial doubters. But it was her empathy, her innate ability to connect with people, that truly defined her as an officer. She could de-escalate a volatile domestic dispute with a calm word, earn the trust of frightened children, and show genuine compassion to victims, all while maintaining an air of unwavering professionalism. Old Man Hemlock, who ran the town's only hardware store and was notoriously grumpy, was known to save the first ripe tomato from his garden for Linda each summer. Kids on their bikes would wave, not with the awe reserved for a uniform, but with the affection given to a trusted older sister. Her passion for the job was infectious. She'd initiated a neighborhood watch program in the quieter, more vulnerable parts of town, organized self-defense classes for women, and often spent her own time mentoring at-risk youth, trying to steer them away from the nascent drug problems that were beginning to cast a shadow even over idyllic Bensfield. She believed in proactive policing, in building bridges, not just enforcing laws. She saw the uniform not as a symbol of power, but of protection and service. The loss of Linda wasn't just the loss of a police officer, it was the extinguishing of a bright, hopeful light. The spring of 1977 had been particularly beautiful, the coastal wildflowers painting the hillsides in vibrant hues. The night she disappeared, the 14th of April, was clear, the stars brilliant over the Pacific. She'd been on the late shift, a solo patrol, a common enough assignment despite her gender. She had insisted on being treated no differently than her male colleagues. Her last radio transmission, logged at 11:52 p.m., was a routine check-in, her voice calm, giving her location near the treacherous coastal highway, Route 12, the stretch that wound perilously close to the cliffs. Then, silence. The initial hours of her absence were filled with a gnawing anxiety that quickly escalated to full-blown panic. By dawn, a massive search operation was underway. Officers from neighboring jurisdictions, Coast Guard cutters, helicopters, and scores of local volunteers combed every inch of the coastline, every dense thicket of redwood and pine, every shadowy ravine. They found nothing. No skid marks on the serpentine road, no broken guardrails, no debris in the churning water below the cliffs. It was as if Linda McAllister and her brand-new Ford Fairlane police cruiser had been plucked from the earth by an unseen hand. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The official investigation, led by a department struggling with its own grief and the mounting pressure, explored every conceivable avenue. Had she fallen asleep at the wheel? Had there been a sudden mechanical failure? Or was it something more sinister? Linda had been involved in several significant arrests in the year leading up to her disappearance. Most notably, the takedown of a regional drug distribution ring operating out of a secluded ranch inland from Bensfield. One name that had surfaced repeatedly during that investigation was a low-level but notoriously volatile dealer named Marco Thorne. Linda had personally apprehended him after a tense standoff. Thorne had reportedly made veiled threats against her, muttering about cops getting what they deserve, especially a woman cop sticking her nose where it didn't belong. But Thorne had an alibi for the night Linda vanished, a flimsy one, according to some of the younger officers who had idolized Linda, but enough for the senior detectives, perhaps eager for a resolution, to dismiss him as a serious suspect, especially with no other evidence. As the years passed without a trace, the official narrative slowly solidified around the theory of a tragic accident, the treacherous road, a moment of fatigue, the unforgiving ocean. It was a simpler, less disturbing explanation than the alternatives. The case was eventually classified as missing, presumed accidental death. For many in the department and the town, it was a way to find some semblance of closure, to move on. But for others, a nagging doubt remained, a persistent whisper that justice for Linda had been compromised, her case too quickly relegated to the cold files, perhaps because she was a woman, her disappearance a tragic anomaly rather than a crime demanding relentless pursuit. The vibrant force that was Linda McAllister was reduced to a fading photograph on a memorial wall, a cautionary tale whispered to new recruits. What was lost with Linda was immeasurable. A daughter, a friend, a dedicated officer. But more than that, a symbol of progress, a testament to courage in the face of ingrained prejudice. Her empty chair in the briefing room was a constant, silent rebuke to the easy assumptions and the quiet biases that had perhaps underestimated both her capabilities and the dangers she truly faced. The discovery of her car, 13 years later, wasn't just about finding a vehicle. It was about reopening a wound and, for some, reigniting a faint, almost extinguished hope that the truth, however painful, might finally surface. The rusted metal beneath Blackwood Point held not just the remnants of a car, but the echoes of a life cut short and a promise unfulfilled. The brightest star in Bensfield's small firmament had been snuffed out, and the darkness she left behind had, for many, never truly lifted. The recovery of Officer Linda McAllister's patrol car from its watery grave was a monumental undertaking, a grim ballet of man and machine against the relentless power of the Pacific. For days, the area around Blackwood Point buzzed with activity. Salvage crews, forensic teams, and a phalanx of police officers, both local and from the state's cold case unit, descended upon the scene. The Bensfield Police Department, now led by Chief Dale Harris, a man who had been a rookie detective back in 1977 and had peripherally worked on Linda's initial disappearance, found itself thrust back into a spotlight it had long since evaded on this particular case. The car itself, once hauled onto a flatbed truck, was a horrifying testament to 13 years spent in the ocean's corrosive embrace. It was less a vehicle and more a mangled sculpture of rust and decay. Yet, within its ravaged frame, lay the potential for answers, for a truth that had been submerged for far too long. The initial excitement of the discovery, however, soon began to curdle into a familiar, uncomfortable sensation for some of the older residents and retired officers, the distinct feeling of déjà vu, of a system gearing up for what might be another exercise in carefully managed narratives rather than a relentless pursuit of justice. In 1977, the investigation into Linda's disappearance had been plagued by a subtle, yet pervasive, undercurrent of dismissiveness. It wasn't overt, not always, but it was there, in the way some senior officers had initially theorized she might have run off, overwhelmed by the pressures of a man's job. It was there in the slightly too quick acceptance of the accident theory, despite the utter lack of evidence, no skid marks, no witnesses, no debris found at the time. The search, while extensive, had lacked a certain desperate ferocity, some whispered, that might have been present had it been one of the established male officers who had vanished. Linda was an outsider in some ways, a pioneer, and pioneers often face resistance, even in their absence. The reopened investigation in 1990, spearheaded by the state, brought with it a veneer of modern efficiency. Computers, DNA, though its forensic application was still in its relative infancy, and advanced forensic techniques were now available. Yet, the ghosts of the past proved difficult to exorcise. Chief Harris, a man whose career had been built on a reputation for solid, if uninspired, police work, seemed visibly uncomfortable with the renewed scrutiny. His public statements were carefully worded, emphasizing cooperation with the state investigators, but also subtly reinforcing the most probable accident theory. "We are exploring all possibilities," he'd stated at a press conference, his gaze steady but his brow furrowed. "But we must remember the treacherous nature of Route 12, especially back then. It's a tragic reminder of the dangers all officers face." For those who remembered Linda's vibrant energy and her meticulous professionalism, these pronouncements felt like a soft dismissal, an attempt to gently guide the narrative back to the most convenient conclusion. Sarah Jenkins, a close friend of Linda's since high school and now a local journalist, found herself battling a rising tide of frustration. She'd been one of the few who had consistently, over the years, prodded the department about Linda's case. Her inquiries often met with polite but firm deflections. "It's like they wanted her to be a tragic victim of circumstance," Sarah confided to her old editor, who had also been around in '77. Easier to swallow than the idea that someone murdered a cop, a female cop, and got away with it. Or worse, that the department didn't try hard enough because of who she was. The town's reaction was a mixture of sorrow, renewed curiosity, and an uncomfortable introspection. The older generation remembered Linda vividly. The younger ones knew her only as a name on a plaque, a local legend of a bygone era. The discovery of the car forced a confrontation with a past that many had preferred to leave undisturbed. It resurrected not just the memory of Linda, but also the unsettling questions about the initial investigation. Within the Bensfield PD itself, the reopened case caused ripples. Some of the veteran officers, contemporaries of Linda, exchanged knowing, weary glances. They remembered the locker room talk back then, the casual sexism, the resistance to a woman wearing the badge. They remembered how Linda had to work twice as hard to prove herself, how every mistake was magnified, every success scrutinized. Had that same underlying bias influenced the urgency and direction of the search when she vanished? One such veteran was Sergeant Frank Miller, a man nearing retirement, his face etched with the cynicism of a long career. He'd been a young patrolman when Linda joined. "She was a good cop," he told a junior officer who asked about her. "Too good for some, maybe. Never backed down. That Thorne fella, the druggie she busted, he was bad news. Spat in her face, threatened her right there in the booking room. I remember thinking, that one's got a long memory for a grudge. But when she went missing, it was all, poor girl, probably lost control. Nobody wanted to open that can of worms." Miller's eyes held a distant, troubled look. Easier to call it an accident. Less paperwork. Less scandal. The Marcus Thorne angle, which had been so quickly dismissed in 1977, was now being re-examined by the state investigators, albeit with the handicap of 13 years of lost time. Thorne, they discovered, was still around, though his life had spiraled further into criminality. He was currently serving a sentence for armed robbery in a state penitentiary. When questioned by the new investigators about Linda McAllister, Thorne was reportedly smug and uncooperative. His alibi from 1977, that he was at an all-night poker game miles away, as flimsy and uncorroborated now as it had been then. Yet, without new evidence, he remained just a person of interest. The system, both in 1977 and to some extent in 1990, seemed to operate with a built-in inertia, a reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, particularly when they involved its own potential shortcomings or the unsettling reality of violence against one of its own, especially a woman who dared to enter a male-dominated world. The official narrative from 1977 had been one of tragic misadventure. The emerging narrative in 1990, while more open to scrutiny, still seemed to carry an echo of that earlier, simpler explanation. The rust-eaten patrol car was a tangible piece of evidence, a starting point, but the rust of indifference, of societal biases that had perhaps allowed a crime to go uninvestigated or an officer to be forgotten, was a far more insidious and challenging obstacle to overcome. The system's response, then and now, was a muddled reflection of a society grappling with change, a society that perhaps hadn't valued Linda's life and her service as much as it should have. The car was found, but justice for Linda McAllister still felt as submerged as her cruiser had been for all those years. The mangled, rust-eaten hulk of Linda McAllister's Ford Fairlane patrol car sat under harsh fluorescent lights in the cavernous evidence garage of the state police facility, a silent, corroded oracle. It drew investigators, forensic specialists, and even a few of the older Bensfield officers like moths to a flame, each hoping it would yield its 13-year-old secrets. Among the latter was Sergeant Frank Miller. He'd made the drive up to the state facility on his day off, a gnawing unease having settled in his gut since the car's recovery. He'd told himself it was just to see it, a morbid curiosity. But as he stood before the wreckage, the acrid smell of oxidized metal and dried brine filling his nostrils, something else began to stir, a dislodged fragment of memory, sharp and insistent. He remembered the night Linda vanished. He'd been on the earlier shift, finishing up paperwork at the station when she'd come in, bright-eyed and ready for her solo patrol. He recalled a brief exchange, some light banter. She'd been excited about a new hiking trail she planned to explore on her next day off. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so he'd thought for 13 years. The official line had always been Route 12, the treacherous coastal highway. That's where her last radio call had placed her. That's where everyone assumed she'd gone off the road. Blackwood Point, where the car was found, was consistent with that theory. A jagged maw waiting to swallow anything that strayed too close. But standing there, looking at the almost skeletal remains of the cruiser, a different image began to surface in Miller's mind, an image he'd long suppressed or dismissed as irrelevant. It was from later that same night, hours after his shift had ended. He'd been unable to sleep, a rare occurrence for him, and had decided to take a late-night drive, a habit he sometimes indulged when his mind was restless. He hadn't driven along Route 12. Instead, he'd taken the quieter inland Old Mill Road, a winding two-lane blacktop that cut through the dense redwood forests and eventually looped back towards the coast, emerging several miles north of Blackwood Point. It wasn't a standard patrol route, especially late at night. As he replayed that drive in his mind, the details, previously hazy, began to sharpen with an unsettling clarity. He remembered passing the turnoff to the abandoned Coleman Quarry, a desolate, eerie place even in daylight, its entrance usually blocked by a dilapidated wooden gate. That night, the gate had been ajar, and parked just inside, almost hidden by the overgrown foliage, he'd seen a vehicle, not clearly, just a dark shape. He'd slowed, his cop instincts mildly pricking, but then dismissed it. Probably just kids, or a couple seeking privacy. He hadn't thought to call it in. It was outside Bensfield PD's immediate jurisdiction, technically county land, and he was off duty. But now, staring at Linda's car, another fragment attached itself to that memory. He'd caught a fleeting glimpse of color on the car at the quarry entrance. Dark blue, standard police cruiser blue. At the time, his mind hadn't made the connection. Why would a police car be at the abandoned quarry, lights off, gate ajar? The area was known for illicit dumping, sometimes rumored to be a meeting spot for low-level criminals, but rarely patrolled. Over the next few days, this fragmented memory gnawed at Frank Miller. He tried to push it away, telling himself it was the power of suggestion, the grim spectacle of the recovered car playing tricks on his mind. 13 years was a long time. Memories frayed became unreliable. Besides, If he brought it up now, after all this time, what would they think? That he was an old fool? Or worse, that he'd withheld something crucial? The state investigators, led by a sharp, no-nonsense detective named Isabel Ramirez, were methodically working their way through the old files and re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Miller knew it was only a matter of time before they got to him for a more formal statement than the brief chat he'd had at the Bensfield station. The impetus to speak finally came from an unexpected source. Sarah Jenkins, Linda's journalist friend, published an impassioned piece in the local paper, not just recounting Linda's life and the tragedy of her loss, but also subtly questioning the thoroughness of the original investigation, hinting at the biases Linda faced. Reading it, Miller felt a pang of something akin to shame. Linda had been a good kid, a damn good cop. She deserved more than a convenient accident theory. He found Detective Ramirez at the temporary command post they'd set up in Bensfield. She was younger than he'd expected, with tired eyes that missed nothing. He hesitated for a moment, then took the plunge. "Detective," he began, his voice huskier than usual, "there's something I should have mentioned a long time ago. Something I saw the night Linda McAllister disappeared." Ramirez listened intently, her expression unreadable, as Miller recounted his late-night drive, the open quarry gate, the dark blue car. He emphasized his uncertainty, the passage of time, but the image, he explained, had become increasingly vivid. At the time, he said, his gaze fixed on a point beyond her shoulder, I dismissed it. But Linda's car, it was a new model Fairlane, dark blue, not many of those around, even unmarked. Ramirez didn't dismiss him. Instead, she asked a series of precise questions. The exact time, the condition of the road, anything else he'd seen or heard, any lights, any other vehicles on Old Mill Road that night. Miller answered as best he could. No lights from the car at the quarry. That's what was odd. Just sitting there, and the gate being open. That old gate was always falling apart, but usually someone propped it shut. When he mentioned Marcus Marco Thorne and Thorne's known haunts, Ramirez's eyes sharpened. Did Thorne or his associates ever use the Coleman quarry? It was rumored, Miller admitted. A place to lie low, maybe stash things. It's isolated, miles from anywhere. Detective Ramirez made no promises, offered no immediate conclusions, but she thanked him, and her gaze held a new intensity. The Coleman quarry, she mused, tapping her pen on her notepad. We have detailed search logs from 1,977. Every grid, every road. The quarry was listed as checked, cleared. Miller felt a chill. Maybe it was checked in daylight, he said slowly. Maybe whoever was there that night was long gone by then. Or maybe whoever checked it didn't look hard enough. The implication hung heavy in the air. If Linda's car, or a police car, had been at the quarry that night, it completely contradicted the narrative of her accidentally driving off Route 12. The quarry was inland, in the opposite direction from the coastal highway if one assumed she was heading south, as her last radio call vaguely implied. It suggested a deviation, an unplanned stop, or something far more sinister. Frank Miller left the command post feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a different kind of burden, the burden of a truth slowly, painfully, emerging from the shifting sands of memory. He didn't know if his recollection would lead anywhere, if it was even accurate, but he'd spoken it. For Linda, the old, rusted patrol car had done more than just reappear. It had started to dislodge the carefully constructed edifice of the past, one forgotten detail, one suppressed memory at a time. The truth about Linda McAllister's final hours, it seemed, was not buried solely beneath the waves of Blackwood Point, but also in the shadowed recesses of places like the Coleman Quarry, and in the minds of those who had been there, on the periphery of a tragedy, 13 years before. Detective Isabel Ramirez was not a woman easily swayed by hunches or decades-old hazy recollections, but Frank Miller's testimony about the Coleman Quarry had a ring of reluctant truth to it, the kind that often surfaced when guilt or a long-dormant conscience finally pricked through years of silence. The original 1,977 search logs did indeed show the quarry as checked and cleared. But Ramirez knew from experience that checked and cleared could mean anything from a thorough, inch-by-inch sweep to a cursory glance from a patrol car window, especially if the area wasn't initially considered high priority. Given that all attention had been focused on Route 12 and the coastline, an inland, abandoned quarry might have received less rigorous scrutiny. The first crucial discrepancy Ramirez's team unearthed was subtle but significant. The officer who had signed off on clearing the Coleman quarry in 1977 was a Deputy Harks, a county sheriff's officer, as the quarry fell just outside Bensfield PD's jurisdiction. Harks had retired a few years later, moving out of state. His report, a terse one-line entry, simply stated, "Coleman Quarry and access roads searched. Negative findings." However, cross-referencing Harks's activity logs and fuel receipts for that day, Ramirez found something odd. Harks had refueled his vehicle in a town significantly south of the quarry much earlier in the day than his reported search time. While not conclusive proof of anything, it suggested his presence near the quarry might have been later, or perhaps less extensive, than his report implied. It was a tiny crack, but enough for Ramirez to deploy a preliminary, unpublicized survey team to the Coleman quarry. The quarry itself was a forbidding place. Decades of disuse had allowed nature to reclaim much of it. The main pit was a deep, water-filled scar in the earth, its surface a still, black mirror reflecting the brooding sky. The surrounding area was a labyrinth of crumbling outbuildings, rusting machinery, and treacherous, overgrown tracks. 13 years of debris, both natural and man-made, littered the landscape. For 2 days, the survey team, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, meticulously combed the area Miller had indicated, the old entrance and the dense thicket just inside the dilapidated gate. They found plenty of discarded junk, old tires, rusted cans, the skeletal remains of a washing machine. Then, on the third afternoon, a metal detector pinged insistently over a patch of ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles and compacted earth, not far from where Miller had estimated seeing the dark blue car. Excavation began cautiously. The soil was damp and heavy. A few inches down, they hit something metallic, not a large object but definitely man-made. Brushes replaced shovels. Slowly, painstakingly, they unearthed a small, heavily corroded metal box about the size of a standard ammunition case. It was latched shut, the metal warped and pitted. There were no obvious markings. Back at the temporary command post, anticipation was electric as the forensics team carefully worked to open the box. The hinges groaned in protest before finally giving way. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like rotted, oil-stained fabric, lay several items. The first was a service-issue flashlight, its casing battered but identifiable as police equipment from the 1970s. Beside it lay a standard police-issue utility belt, its leather cracked and stiff. Attached to the belt were several pouches, a handcuff case, and crucially, an empty holster. But it was the contents of one of the sealed pouches that sent a shockwave through the investigation. Inside, protected somewhat from the elements, was a small, plastic-bagged notebook. It was a standard officer's memo book. The paper was brittle and water-stained, the ink faded, but many entries were still legible. The handwriting, confirmed later by comparison with Linda McAllister's personnel file, was unmistakably hers. The last few entries detailed routine traffic stops and observations from her final shift. Then, a final hurried entry, dated the 14th of April, 1977, the time noted as approximately 11:30 p.m., roughly 20 minutes before her last radio call. It read, "Suspicious vehicle, dark sedan, no plates visible, turned onto Old Mill towards Coleman. Did not call in. Following at distance. Possible 10 to 55 traffic stop if opportunity arises. Subject, see unknown." This was a bombshell. Linda hadn't accidentally stumbled into trouble on Route 12. She had chosen to deviate from her patrol route, following a suspicious vehicle towards the quarry. She hadn't radioed it in immediately, perhaps wanting to assess the situation first, a common, if sometimes risky, officer discretion. This entry completely upended the long-held accident theory. But the most significant find was still to come, lying beneath the notebook in the corroded box. It was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, the standard service weapon for Bensfield PD. Officers in 1977, Linda McAllister's service weapon. Its serial number matched her records. The cylinder was fully loaded, all 6 rounds intact. It had not been fired. This was the twist that no one had anticipated. If Linda had been attacked, if she had been in a confrontation that led to her death and the dumping of her car, why was her weapon, fully loaded, found discarded in this box, miles from where her car was recovered? Why not on her person or in her vehicle? An officer, especially one as capable as Linda, would instinctively reach for their weapon if threatened, unless she never had the chance, or unless the weapon was taken from her before any lethal confrontation. Detective Ramirez stared at the items laid out on the evidence table: the flashlight, the belt, the empty holster, the notebook with its chilling final entry, and the unfired revolver. This wasn't the scene of a simple accident, nor even a straightforward ambush. This suggested something more complex, something that involved disarming her first. The discovery of the box and its contents shifted the entire focus of the investigation. The Coleman quarry was no longer a peripheral point of interest. It was central to Linda McAllister's last conscious hours. The car at Blackwood Point was the end of the story, but the quarry held the key to its beginning. And then, a forensic technician, carefully examining the rotted fabric lining the bottom of the metal box, found something else. Something so small it had almost been missed. A single, tarnished cufflink. It was old-fashioned, a simple, silver oval with a small, indistinct monogram. It definitely hadn't belonged to Linda. It wasn't standard police issue. This cufflink, innocuous yet completely out of place, became the new focal point. Whose was it? How did it get into a box with Linda McAllister's equipment? The narrative had just taken a sharp, unexpected turn. Linda hadn't just driven off a cliff. She hadn't just been the victim of a random lowlife like Thorne. The presence of her unfired weapon, carefully stowed away with other items from her duty belt, and the appearance of this single, elegant cufflink hinted at a scenario far more calculated and perhaps involving someone who didn't fit the profile of a typical violent criminal. The grim secret of the quarry was not just about Linda's last actions, but about who she encountered there and why they had gone to such lengths to ensure her gun was never fired. The discovery of the metal box, Linda McAllister's unfired service weapon, and the incongruous silver cufflink shifted the tectonic plates of the investigation. The Coleman quarry, once a footnote in a flawed 1977 report, now pulsed at the epicenter of a 13-year-old crime. Detective Isabel Ramirez, her team galvanized by the tangible evidence, focused their formidable resources on the cufflink. It was their Rosetta Stone, a small, tarnished piece of silver that whispered of a presence at the quarry, someone other than Linda, someone who likely hadn't anticipated leaving such a personal marker behind. Forensic enhancement of the cufflink revealed a barely perceptible monogram, a stylized CEJ. The design was classic, elegant, suggesting a certain affluence and an older generation. Ramirez's investigators began the painstaking task of cross-referencing individuals with those initials who might have had connections to Bensfield or the surrounding county in 1977, particularly anyone with the means or motive to be involved in clandestine activities at an abandoned quarry. They scoured old business registries, social club memberships, property records, and even archived newspapers for mentions of prominent figures. Simultaneously, the contents of Linda's notebook provided a crucial timeline. Her final entry, noting the suspicious dark sedan heading towards Coleman Quarry around 11:30 p.m., placed her there. Her last official radio check-in at 11:52 p.m., giving her location near Route 12, now seemed like a deliberate misdirection, or perhaps a tragically optimistic assessment that she would soon return to her designated patrol area after a quick, unofficial detour. Or, more chillingly, it could have been made under duress, a final, forced transmission. The name that eventually surfaced from the deep dive into the CEJ monogram was Charles Elijah Jenkinson. In the 1970s, Jenkinson had been a highly influential figure in the region, a wealthy lumber magnate with diverse business interests, a philanthropist with his name on several municipal buildings, and a man known for his discreet but potent political connections. He owned vast tracts of land, including, as one old county map revealed, property that bordered the disused Coleman Quarry. Jenkinson, now in his late 70s and in frail health, still resided in an opulent estate, a few towns over from Bensfield. The connection was tenuous, based solely on a monogram and proximity, but it was enough for Ramirez to dig deeper. She discovered that in the mid-1970s, Jenkinson's timber empire had faced financial difficulties due to changing environmental regulations and market slumps. There were whispers, never substantiated, of him being involved in less savory ventures to recoup his losses. The abandoned quarry, adjacent to his land and with its secluded access roads, would have been an ideal location for illicit activities, smuggling perhaps, or the discreet transfer of black market goods. Ramirez also revisited the file of Deputy Harks, the officer who had supposedly cleared the quarry in 1977. Harks had passed away 5 years prior, taking any secrets he might have held to his grave. However, a re-examination of his financials from late 1977 showed an unexplained cash deposit into his bank account, equivalent to several months' salary, shortly after Linda's disappearance. It was circumstantial, but damningly suggestive. Had Harks been paid to conduct a deliberately superficial search, or to file a false report, ensuring the quarry remained undisturbed? Armed with this constellation of disturbing possibilities, Detective Ramirez, accompanied by a senior state prosecutor, arranged to interview Charles Elijah Jenkinson. They found him in a sunroom overlooking manicured gardens, a pale, shrunken version of the robust figure in old photographs. His hands, gnarled with age, trembled slightly as he sipped water. His lawyer was present, watchful and wary. Ramirez began by discussing Linda McAllister, the recovered car, the renewed investigation. Jenkinson offered practiced condolences, his voice thin. When she produced the silver cufflink, placing it on the polished mahogany table between them, a flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed his aged face before his lawyer interjected, questioning its relevance. "This cufflink, Mr. Jenkinson," Ramirez stated, her voice calm but firm, was found with Officer McAllister's equipment, hidden at the Corlerman Quarry. The monogram appears to be CEJ. Would you happen to recognize it? Jenkinson stared at the cufflink, his breathing shallow. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "They were a gift," he whispered, his eyes avoiding Ramirez's, "from my late wife, many years ago." The dam of 13 years began to crack. Over the next few hours, through a combination of carefully presented evidence, Linda's notebook entry, the proximity of his land to the quarry, the suspicious deposit in Harks's account, and now the cufflink, and the weight of his own conscience, the story of that April night in 1977, slowly, painfully unraveled. Jenkinson, it turned out, hadn't acted alone. He had indeed been using the quarry as a clandestine meeting point for a smuggling operation involving high-value stolen art, a desperate gamble to save his failing businesses. The dark sedan Linda had followed was one of his associates, en route to a late-night exchange. Linda McAllister, brave and perhaps a little reckless in her pursuit of the suspicious vehicle, had stumbled upon this high-stakes transaction. She had confronted Jenkinson and his 2 associates. There was no shootout. Faced with exposure, Jenkinson, a man terrified of losing his reputation and fortune, had made a fateful decision. His associates, younger and more brutal, had overpowered Linda. They disarmed her, taking her belt and flashlight, and stowed them in an old ammunition box they found in one of the quarry's derelict sheds. Jenkinson himself, in his panic, had fumbled with the box, losing his cufflink in the process. Their initial plan might have been just to scare her off, to destroy any evidence she might have collected. But Linda, even unarmed, was not easily intimidated. She had seen their faces, understood what she had uncovered. The decision to kill her was made in cold, desperate fear. They then drove her police cruiser, with her inside, to the remote cliffs of Blackwood Point, staging it to look like a tragic accident, a narrative they hoped the world would readily accept, especially for a young woman on solo patrol on a dangerous road. Deputy Harks, it was strongly implied, had been bribed by Jenkinson to ensure the quarry was never properly searched. One of Jenkinson's associates had died years ago. The other, now a man in his late 50s, was located and arrested based on Jenkinson's confession. Jenkinson himself, frail and facing the ruin of his carefully constructed legacy, was charged. The truth, when it finally broke over Bensfield, was a bitter draught. It wasn't a shadowy drug lord like Marco Thorne who had silenced Linda, but a pillar of the community, a man whose name was etched on buildings. The revelation laid bare the hypocrisy and the dark undercurrents that could exist beneath a veneer of respectability. It also cast a harsh light on the initial investigation, highlighting how easily the voice and dedication of a young female officer had been dismissed, her disappearance conveniently filed away as an accident, allowing men like Jenkinson to believe they had gotten away with murder. Sergeant Frank Miller, on hearing the news, felt a profound sadness, but also a quiet sense of vindication for Linda. His fragmented memory had, in the end, helped point the way. Sarah Jenkins wrote what many considered her finest piece, an elegy for Linda and an indictment of a system that had failed her, not just in 1977, but for 13 long years. Linda McAllister's badge, number 107, was eventually recovered from the silt-filled interior of her patrol car. It was tarnished, like the reputation of some who had outlived her, but its symbolism remained potent. It represented her courage, her dedication, and the ultimate price she paid for simply doing her job, for daring to look where others wouldn't, for being the brightest star Bensfield had, extinguished far too soon by the darkness she sought to combat. Justice, delayed for 13 agonizing years, had finally, painstakingly, arrived. The ocean had given up its dead, and the quarry, its grim secret. Linda McAllister could finally rest, her sacrifice no longer a forgotten footnote, but a stark reminder of the true cost of silence and the enduring power of truth.